Take one more step, and the mare will break her own leg. The warning came from the giant woman kneeling in Gideon Mercer's barnyard before sunrise, one broad shoulder wedged beneath a fallen fence beam while an injured bay mare trembled in the mud. Gideon stopped with his rifle lowered beside his thigh. The stranger was taller than most men, even on one knee, and the muscles beneath her torn blue sleeves stood hard as braided rope. Road dust streaked her face. Sweat darkened the light brown hair clinging to her temples, yet her voice held no threat. "Come around slow," she murmured. "Let her see your hands." Gideon obeyed. The mare rolled one frightened eye toward him. Blood marked the hide above her fetlock, but the leg remained straight. The stranger had lifted enough of the cottonwood rail to keep the animal from crushing herself. Gideon slid his hands beneath the beam. On three. Her gray-green eyes met his. Neither questioned the other's strength. Together, they raised it. Some mornings entered a life quietly. Others arrived carrying a question that would not leave. What had brought a woman of such astonishing power to a lonely ranch before dawn, and why did the old cowboy look at her as though the past had stepped from the darkness? The truth was more complicated than either understood. Those who stayed until the end would learn what the second coffee cup meant. As this old memory traveled, they were invited to offer alike and share where they were listening from, so the distance might show how far a wounded heart could wander before finding home. The mare collapsed once the rail cleared. The stranger released the beam carefully, then placed one enormous hand against the animal's neck. "Easy, little sister." The words were so tender that Gideon felt something shift beneath his ribs. He crouched and examined the wound. A shallow cut, no broken bone. The mare would limp, but she would live. Only then did Gideon study the woman. She wore a faded blue dress altered for work, reinforced at the waist and divided beneath the skirt for riding. Every seam strained across her shoulders. Heavy boots sank into the earth. A leather belt held a knife, cord, and an empty purse. "You have a wagon?" She nodded toward the north road, half a mile back. The axle split. "Anyone with you?" "No." One word, no apology inside it. The eastern sky paled behind the cottonwoods. Gideon rose with the care required by his old hip and extended a hand. The woman watched it before accepting. Her grip was restrained, as though she had learned that people feared what she could do without effort. "Mirella," she offered. "Gideon." Her gaze moved toward the ranch house, where smoke rose from the chimney. "I can pay for repairs with work." "You already did work. That mare did not belong to me." "She does now, in part." Confusion softened her severe face. Gideon turned before she could see that he had nearly smiled. Inside the kitchen, the warmth smelled of coffee, biscuits, and cedar smoke. Mirella stopped beyond the doorway. Her eyes settled on the table. 2 tin cups waited beside 2 plates. Gideon had laid them out before hearing the mare. He did it every morning. 1 cup for himself, 1 for a man dead 30 years. Mirella removed her hat and held it against her chest. "You expected someone?" "No." She looked again at the second place. Gideon poured coffee into both cups. "Sit." She lowered herself into the largest chair, testing it before trusting her weight. That small act told him much. She had spent years entering rooms built for smaller bodies and smaller expectations. They ate in silence. Mirella broke each biscuit neatly, though hunger sharpened every movement. Gideon noticed old scars across her knuckles, bruising beneath one sleeve, and the way she watched the door whenever wind touched the porch. "You can stay in this bunkhouse until the creek drops," he offered. "I need the wagon mended. That too. I will earn it." His dark blue eyes rested on her. "You keep saying that. Men hear better when payment is mentioned." "Some men." Her mouth tightened as if she had no answer prepared for kindness without negotiation. After breakfast, Gideon hitched a mule and rode with her toward the road. The wagon leaned into a ditch beneath the pines, one wheel twisted outward. A canvas cover concealed her belongings. Everything she owned appeared to fit beneath it. Mirella moved ahead to clear a branch. Something slipped from her dress and landed in the grass. Gideon dismounted. It was a brass medallion darkened by age, stamped with a rising sun above 3 lines representing a river. His breath stopped. 30 years earlier, another hand had worn its twin while floodwater climbed through the cottonwoods, and a dying man shouted one final command across the river. Mirella turned and saw the medallion in Gideon's palm. For the first time that morning, fear crossed her face. Gideon lifted his eyes to hers, and the quiet between them became heavier than the fallen timber. He knew exactly whose daughter had come to his ranch. Gideon closed his fingers around the brass medallion before the morning wind could cool it. Mirella stood beside the broken wagon, broad shoulders held still beneath the faded blue cloth. The fear in her face vanished quickly, but not before he saw it. "You know that mark?" Gideon placed the medallion in her palm. "I have seen one like it. Where?" He bent to inspect the split axle. Long ago, her hand remained open between them, waiting for more. None came. The silence hardened. The repair would take 2 days if the creek stayed high and the old forge held heat. Perhaps 3. He told her so without looking up. Then, "I will work 3 days. You will eat 3 days. I will work." The answer carried the stubbornness of a person who trusted labor more than promises. By noon, Gideon had learned that Mirella could hold a wagon wheel steady while he drove a pin and split a knot of pine that had defeated his maul for half a winter. She never displayed her strength. She used it quietly, almost apologetically, and looked away whenever he noticed. At dusk, he found her repairing the bunkhouse step. It was loose. It has been loose 6 years. That is a long time to step around a problem. Gideon considered the board beneath her hands. Some problems learn to feel like part of the house. Mirella glanced at him, then returned to the nail. Neither spoke of the medallion. The next morning, Gideon entered the kitchen before sunrise and found the stove burning. Mirella stood at the counter with flour on her forearms. A pan of biscuits rested near the fire. The 2 tin cups waited on the table exactly where he always placed them. "You rise early," he murmured. "I slept badly. Bunkhouse cold?" "No." He understood enough to leave the answer alone. From that morning forward, their days found a rhythm. Gideon fed the horses while Mirella hauled water. She mended the corral gate before he asked. He sharpened her knife while she slept. When the skin across her knuckles cracked from lye soap and cold wind, a tin of salve appeared beside her cup. Mirella turned it over in her hand. "I did not ask for this. No, I can buy my own." "Then save your money for something harder to find." She used it that night. By the 4th morning, the second cup no longer troubled her. She did not ask whom it had once belonged to. Gideon did not explain why hearing her boots cross the porch made the empty chair feel less like a grave. The wagon axle required a new iron strap, and the ranch stores had run low. Gideon hitched the buckboard for town. Mirella climbed beside him, carrying a list of flour, lamp oil, and nails. The settlement grew quiet when they arrived. Men outside the feed store stopped loading sacks. 2 women near the mercantile stared openly. A boy whispered to his father, who pulled him closer as though Mirella might seize the child. A narrow man in a red waistcoat emerged from the saloon. Recognition brightened his expression. "Well now, Mirella of the mighty arms." She froze. The man swept off his hat. "I watched you bend an iron bar in Abilene. Folks paid good money for that." A few people laughed. Mirella's hands closed at her sides. I do not perform. You used to. Perhaps the town could gather a purse." His gaze moved across the crowd. "What should we test? A horseshoe? Maybe she could lift old Mercer and carry him home." The laughter sharpened. Gideon stepped onto the boardwalk. He did not raise his voice. "Her name is Mirella." The man's smile weakened. "That is what I called her." "No, you called for a spectacle." Gideon moved between them. Age had taken speed from him, but not presence. His shoulders filled the space, and the stillness in his face emptied the laughter from the street. "She came for supplies. Anyone who cannot remember his manners can remember my fence line." The narrow man replaced his hat. "No harm intended. Harm does not become harmless because a coward enjoyed it." No one laughed again. Inside the mercantile, Mirella studied jars she did not need while Gideon gathered hardware. Her breathing remained too careful. "You did not have to do that," she whispered. "Yes." "Why?" "Because they were wrong. That has never stopped a crowd before. It stopped this one." She looked at him then, not with gratitude alone, but with something more dangerous. Trust, perhaps, or the beginning of dependence, which frightened her enough that she turned away. At the bank, Gideon left her beside the buckboard and entered alone. Mirella arranged the supplies beneath the canvas, but the office window stood partly open. The banker's voice drifted through it. 30 days, Gideon. After that, the ranch goes to public auction." A pause followed. Then Gideon answered, quiet as winter ground, "Do not tell her." Mirella stood motionless with a sack of flour against her chest, and for the first time she understood that the old cowboy had offered her shelter while the roof above him was already being taken away. Mirella did not mention the auction notice on the ride home. She waited until Gideon had unhitched the mule and carried the supplies inside. Then she entered the kitchen with a small canvas purse in one hand. "I have enough to cover several months of the debt." The nails stopped clicking against the table. "No, you did not ask how much. It does not matter. It matters to the bank." Gideon placed the last nail beside the others. His movements remained controlled, which made the refusal feel harder than anger. "You came here with one wagon and everything you own beneath a canvas sheet. You will not empty your purse into my mistakes." Mirella set the money on the table. "You offered shelter when you had little to spare. I offered a roof. You offered safety. That does not make you responsible for the ranch." Her shoulders lifted with a slow breath. "Work makes people responsible for the place that receives it, not after 4 days." The words struck more deeply than he intended. Mirella looked toward the 2 cups near the stove. One had become hers without either of them admitting it. Now that small belonging seemed foolish. 4 days were enough for you to accept my labor. You refused to rest. You accepted every fence, meal, bucket, and stack of wood. Because stopping you would have required tying you to a chair. Then do not tell me I have earned nothing here. The final word trembled. Mirella hated that it did. Gideon saw the hurt, but fear stood in the way of gentleness. If he accepted her money, she might remain from duty. If he refused it, she might leave with enough to build another life. "You earned your wagon repaired," he murmured. "You did not earn my debt." Mirella gathered the purse and walked out before her dignity could break in front of him. By afternoon, the windmill had stopped turning. The cattle crowded near the dry trough while the blades hung motionless above the pasture. Gideon carried tools toward the tower and found Mirella already there with a rope across one shoulder. "The upper rod is jammed. I can manage." "So can I." Neither apologized. Gideon climbed first. His old hip protested on the narrow ladder. Mirella followed, and the tower shivered beneath their combined weight. At the platform, prairie wind pulled her hair across her face. The broken rod had twisted behind the wheel housing. Gideon braced against the frame while Mirella gripped the iron. "Turn when I lift." Metal groaned. The wheel shifted. Mirella strained again. Gideon turned the wrench. The rod slipped free with a violent snap and the platform lurched. His injured leg failed. Mirella caught him around the waist before he struck the railing. For one suspended breath, Gideon rested against her strength. Her face stood close to his. Fear filled her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear for him. Then he straightened. "You can let go." Her arms dropped at once. The wind moved between them. Mirella looked across the pale grassland. "My mother knew this ranch." Gideon became still. "She never gave me the name. Near the end, she told me to find a solitary cowboy west of the Cottonwood River, an old man who poured coffee before sunrise and set a second cup for someone who never came." His hand closed around the wrench. "My wagon broke by accident," she continued. "Coming along this road did not. The truth did not surprise him. Hearing it did. She left me the medallion and a sealed letter. It named no one, only this place. Where is the letter hidden? Why? Because a stranger becomes dangerous when he knows what you seek." When they returned to the ground, Gideon entered the barn and opened a locked cabinet. Mirella remained near the door. He withdrew the brass medallion. She touched the empty place at her belt. You kept it. I found it beneath the wagon after you walked ahead. And you lied. I told you I had seen the mark. You knew more. Yes. Mirella accepted the medallion, but her fingers no longer brushed his. How much more? Gideon faced her fully. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and gathering rain. I knew whose daughter you were before we brought your wagon home. The quiet kindness of the past days changed shape inside her memory. The salve, the repaired knife, his defense in town. Every gesture now carried the shadow of obligation. You watched me sit at that table while knowing why I came. I needed to understand what your mother told you. You could have asked. I was not ready. Mirella closed her fist around the sun. Then perhaps I was never a guest. Perhaps I was another burden you believed you had to carry. Gideon stepped toward her. She moved back. Pain crossed his weathered face. I buried your father beneath the cottonwoods with my own hands. Mirella stopped breathing. Outside, the first drops of rain struck the roof. Gideon lowered his gaze. The old strength in his voice nearly vanished. He trusted me. The river rose. I came home alone. Mirella waited for the rest. Gideon gave her none. Rain followed them from the barn to the cottonwoods. Gideon walked ahead with a lantern in one hand and a shovel resting against his shoulder. Mirella followed without asking where they were going. Mud gathered around her boots. The brass medallion remained locked inside her fist. Beyond the southern pasture, the land fell toward the river. Cottonwood roots twisted through the bank like old hands holding the earth together. Gideon stopped beside a low mound marked by a flat river stone. No name had been carved into it. Mirella stared at the stone. You left him without a name. Your mother asked that no traveler find him. You spoke to her once, through a letter. The rain softened, though water continued dripping from the leaves. Gideon lowered the lantern beside the grave. Your father was named Elias. He helped me build the first barn, dig the first well, and bring the first cattle through the pass. Half of this ranch began beneath his hands. Mirella knelt and brushed moss from the stone. Her powerful fingers trembled. My mother told me he died before I was born. She told you the truth, not all of it. No. Gideon remained standing because he no longer trusted his knees. The river below them moved dark and swollen between the trees. It rained 6 days that spring, he continued. The banks failed before dawn. Elias and I rode out to bring cattle from the lower field. We heard a school wagon somewhere downstream. Children were trapped on a gravel rise. Mirella looked up. And my father? He was with me. The words seemed to cost him breath. A cottonwood came down between us. His horse broke a leg. The water climbed fast. I had one rope and one sound horse. Mirella rose slowly. You chose the wagon. Gideon watched rain strike the grave marker. I rode away while he called after me. The river filled the silence he left behind. How many children? 7. Their teacher too, and you saved them. Yes, but you did not return in time. No. Mirella turned toward the grave. For years, she had imagined an accident without witnesses, a sudden death, a cruel river. Now she saw her father stranded while the man beside her rode toward other voices. Did he beg you to stay? Gideon closed his eyes. He called my name. That answer was not enough, but it was enough to wound. Mirella pressed the medallion against the stone. You should have told me on the first morning. I should have. You should have told my mother. I tried. You should have trusted me with the truth. I was afraid the truth would send you away. She faced him then. Rain shone across her cheeks, though he could not tell where rain ended and grief began. You had no right to protect yourself with my ignorance. Gideon accepted the blow without defense. At the ranch, Mirella packed before midnight. She folded the blue dress she had worn on the road and changed into a gray work dress from her trunk. She placed the medallion inside her mother's letter, tied both with cord, and carried her belongings to the repaired wagon. The creek had dropped enough to cross by morning. Gideon watched from the porch while she secured the canvas. He did not ask her to remain. A plea would have turned his guilt into another chain around her. Before entering the bunkhouse for the final time, Mirella paused. "I will leave at first light." Gideon inclined his head. Neither slept. Long before dawn, Gideon entered the kitchen and found only one cup on the table. He stood before it until the room blurred. Then the door opened behind him. Mirella crossed the floor, took the second cup from the shelf, and placed it opposite his. She poured coffee into both. "I have not forgiven you, I know. I may never understand what you chose. I know that too." She lowered herself into the chair, "But I will not leave while part of the truth remains hidden. You have one day, no riddles, no careful pieces chosen for my comfort." Gideon sat across from her. "And if I stay beyond that day, I stay as an equal. Not as a debt, not as the daughter of a dead friend, not as a helpless woman you need to rescue." His gaze held hers. As an equal. For the first time since the grave, warmth touched the silence between them. Hooves sounded outside. 3 riders stopped before the porch. The banker dismounted with 2 witnesses and an official notice sealed in red wax. "The auction date has been set," he announced through the open door. 26 days from now." Mirella rose, but Gideon reached the porch first. While she read the notice, he accepted another folded document from the banker and moved behind the nearest post. The paper transferred the ranch, livestock, house, and water rights into Mirella's name. Gideon signed before she could turn around. The ink had barely dried when Gideon folded the transfer paper beneath his coat. Mirella remained on the porch with the auction notice in both hands. Her eyes moved across the date, the amount owed, and the bank officer authorized to take possession. The paper trembled once before becoming still. 26 days. Gideon watched the road rather than her face. "That is what it says. You knew before today?" "Yes. And you intended to tell me when?" "When telling you would not change your plans." Mirella lowered the notice. "You still believe my plans belong to you." The banker cleared his throat beside the hitching rail. "There may be another chance. The county livestock gathering begins tomorrow. Buyers and investors will be present. A strong showing from the ranch could earn time." Gideon understood. Public interest might make the bank hesitate before seizing a working property. It was a narrow chance, but narrow chances had kept men alive on worse mornings. By noon the next day, the fairground beyond town filled with wagons, cattle pens, canvas awnings, and dust. Gideon brought 2 yearling horses and a small herd of calves. Mirella rode beside him in the gray work dress, her long hair tied with plain cord. Whispers followed her from the gate. Some remembered the saloon insult. Others remembered old posters from Abilene and Dodge City, where a painted version of Mirella had been advertised beneath words larger than her name. She kept her gaze ahead. Near the livestock ring, a rancher examined the calves and offered less than half their worth. "The bank date is public knowledge," the man muttered. "Desperate cattle bring desperate prices." Gideon turned away. Mirella studied him. "You should take it." "No, it would buy time. It would reward a vulture." Before she could answer, a sharp crack split the air. A gate hinge tore loose on the western corral. A young black stallion burst through the opening with a broken rail dragging from its halter. People scattered between wagons. A child froze near the water trough while the horse struck the ground, wild-eyed and bleeding along one shoulder. Mirella moved before anyone called her name. She reached the child first, lifting him beneath the arms and placing him behind a feed wagon. The stallion wheeled toward the movement. Gideon started across the ring, but Mirella raised one hand without looking back. "Keep them away." The crowd retreated. Mirella stepped into the open space alone. The stallion lunged, then stopped several yards from her. Foam marked its bit. The dragging rail battered the dirt beside its forelegs. Mirella lowered her shoulders and opened both hands. "No one will force you." Her voice carried only far enough for the frightened animal. The horse snorted and pawed. Mirella did not advance. Dust settled over her dress. Around the ring, men held ropes, poles, and rifles, yet none moved beneath Gideon's stare. The stallion lunged again. Mirella stood firm. At the final moment, the animal swerved. The broken rail struck her thigh hard enough to turn her, but she remained upright. Pain tightened her face. She took one slow step after the horse, then another. "You are hurt, that is all." The breathing of the stallion changed. Mirella reached for the loose rope, not the halter. Her fingers closed around it gently. The horse shuddered from nose to flank. For several breaths, neither moved. Then the stallion lowered its head against her enormous shoulder. The fairground became silent. Mirella loosened the broken rail and guided the animal toward an empty pen. Only after the gate closed did she favor her injured leg. The child ran toward her, but his mother caught him first. The woman hesitated, then approached with tears in her eyes. "You saved him." Mirella looked down at the boy. He stayed very brave. The mother took the dusty hand of Mirella between both of hers. One by one, the people nearby removed their hats. The narrow man in the red waistcoat stood at the edge of the crowd. He did not smile now. Gideon crossed the ring and placed himself beside Mirella. A buyer called from near the pens. "Mercer, is she your hired muscle?" Gideon's expression hardened. "She is not muscle for hire. She is not charity, and she is not a show." His gaze traveled across the gathering. Mirella is the finest ranch partner any man could stand beside. Anyone who speaks of her will use her name with respect. Warmth rose into her face. She had heard praise for strength, endurance, and spectacle. No one had ever praised the place she held beside another person. The yearling sold before sunset for a fair price. 3 ranchers placed orders for calves. The banker granted no promise, but his voice carried new caution. At the auction table, an official opened the debt ledger and frowned. "A deposit has already been placed against the Mercer property." Gideon stared at the figure. It matched nearly every dollar Mirella had carried west. He turned towards her. Mirella was no longer beside him. Across the fairground, she stood beneath the cottonwoods with the folded transfer deed open in her hands. Her eyes lifted to Gideon, filled not with gratitude, but with the fury of someone who had discovered that love and betrayal could arrive wearing the same face. Mirella crossed the fairground with the deed clenched in one hand and the medallion pressed beneath the other. Gideon followed her beyond the last cattle pen, where the noise of the gathering faded beneath the cottonwoods. She stopped beside the wagon and turned so sharply that the folded paper struck his chest. "You gave me the ranch. I gave you a chance to keep it. You gave away your home without asking whether I wanted the price attached to it." No price was attached. Your guilt was written across every line. Gideon did not reach for the deed. Wind moved dust between their boots, and the deposit? His voice remained low. "Every dollar you carried west, that was my choice. You were buying the same thing you accused me of buying." Her eyes narrowed. "A place," he continued. "Safety. Permission to remain." Mirella stepped closer. "I was trying to save what we built. We built 4 days of fences and coffee." The words left him before wisdom could stop them. Pain crossed her face, then hardened into anger. "You count days when you are frightened." Gideon looked away. She followed his gaze toward the fairground, where families moved among the wagons and the rescued stallion stood quietly in a shaded pen. "You called me your partner before the whole town," she murmured. "Then you signed away your half before I could stand beside you. I will not let you lose your future to my past." "You do not get to name my future." The truth of it struck deeper than accusation. Gideon had spent 30 years deciding what sacrifice required. He had never asked whether anyone wanted to be saved in the manner he offered. They returned to the ranch after sunset without speaking. In the kitchen, the 2 cups stood where they had left them. Mirella placed the deed between them. "Take it back. The transfer is binding. Then we will bind it again." Gideon removed his hat. Gray-brown hair fell around his weathered face. "You should leave before the auction. No, the wagon is repaired. No, you have money enough to begin elsewhere. Not anymore." His jaw tightened. That was foolish. Mirella struck the table with her palm. The cups jumped. "Do not call love foolish merely because it frightens you." Silence filled the room. Neither moved. The word remained between them, alive and impossible to return. Mirella drew one careful breath. I did not mean to speak it that way. How did you mean it? Her strength seemed to leave her all at once. She lowered herself into the chair and stared at the scarred tabletop. I meant that this ranch became the first place where quiet did not feel like punishment. I meant that your footsteps outside the bunkhouse made sleep easier. I meant that when your leg failed on the windmill, fear entered me so quickly that I could not breathe. Gideon gripped the chair opposite her but did not sit. Mirella, no, you wanted truth. He lowered his gaze. She touched the second cup. I have spent my life being useful, strong enough to lift, strange enough to display, convenient enough to hire. I do not know how to remain somewhere without paying for every kindness. Gideon sat across from her, and I do not know how to ask someone to remain without believing harm will follow. Their eyes met. The mornings became unbearable, he admitted, whenever I imagined this chair empty again. Mirella reached across the table. Her hand stopped halfway. Thunder rolled beyond the western ridge. A second crash followed, nearer and heavier. Gideon rose before the windows began to shake. The storm struck the ranch with violent wind. Rain swept sideways across the yard. A corral gate tore free, and frightened cattle crowded against the lower fence. Gideon and Mirella ran into the darkness. They worked without argument. Gideon opened the north passage while Mirella braced the broken gate with her body. He guided the herd toward higher ground. She carried a trapped calf from the mud after the animal slid beneath a rail. Lightning split the sky. A falling branch struck the bunkhouse roof. Shingles scattered across the yard. Gideon limped towards the damaged building. Mirella caught his arm. The herd first. My papers are inside. Then we save both. Together, they secured the cattle, crossed the flooded yard, and entered the bunkhouse beneath a sagging roof. Water poured through the rafters. Gideon reached for a locked trunk, but another beam cracked above him. Mirella dragged him clear and lifted the fallen timber long enough for him to pull the trunk into the open. Back inside this kitchen, soaked and shaking, they opened it beside the stove. Bundles of letters filled the bottom. Every envelope bore the name of Mirella's mother. Every one had been returned. Mirella untied the oldest bundle. Money orders, unopened notes, and apologies lay preserved beneath the cord. One envelope had been opened. Inside rested a page in the handwriting of her father. Only the first lines remained visible before Gideon took hold of the table. If the river gives you one choice, save the children. Do not come back for me until they are safe. Below those words, another sentence began, and when my daughter comes to you one day. The unfinished sentence remained between them while storm water ran from their clothes onto the kitchen floor. Gideon released the table and turned away. Mirella reached for the page, but his hand covered it first. Not tonight. Her eyes sharpened. You promised the whole truth. I know. Then finish it. Thunder rolled across the ranch. Gideon folded the letter with painful care and placed it inside the trunk. Morning, he murmured. I will tell you at morning. Mirella wanted to force the answer from him. Instead, she watched him carry the trunk toward his room. Weariness bent his shoulders more than age ever had. When she woke before sunrise, the house was silent. One tin cup stood on the table. The other was gone. Mirella crossed the yard and found Gideon's stall empty. His saddle, long coat, and rifle had disappeared. Fresh tracks led south toward the river. She saddled the bay mare before anger could become fear. The storm had swollen every creek. Mud pulled at the mare's hooves as Mirella followed the trail through the cottonwoods. Near the old crossing, she found Gideon beside the water with his horse tied behind him. He held the second cup. You planned to leave without a word. Gideon looked toward the river. I plan to leave you the ranch. I do not want a ranch purchased with your absence. You deserve land without graves beneath it. I deserve the right to choose. The river rushed between them, loud and brown. Mirella dismounted. Read the letter. His fingers tightened around the cup. Read it. Gideon drew the folded page from inside his coat. The paper shook once as he opened it. If the river gives you one choice, save the children. Do not come back for me until they are safe." His voice roughened. "And when my daughter comes to you one day, do not teach her that strength means carrying grief alone. Tell her I chose this. Tell her I was not abandoned." Mirella closed her eyes. For years, she had imagined her father calling for rescue while Gideon rode away. The image dissolved beneath the words he had left behind. "Why did my mother never receive this?" "I sent a copy. She returned it unopened. She believed you killed him." "Yes, and you let her. I believed her hatred was lighter to carry than my explanation." Mirella stepped closer. "That was not mercy. No, that was pride wearing the clothes of sacrifice." His face tightened, but he did not turn away. Gideon looked at the river. "I saved the wagon. By the time I returned, Elias was gone. I found him downstream the next day. Every child lived. Their teacher lived. Yet when I remembered his voice, I heard only the part that called my name." Mirella touched the medallion beneath her dress. "My father did not ask you to die beside him. No. He asked you to live." Gideon lowered his head, "and you obeyed only the part that hurt. The truth landed with greater force than blame. For 30 years, he had mistaken punishment for loyalty. He had poured coffee for the dead while refusing warmth to the living. He had protected the ranch, the grave, and the memory, but never the man who had survived." Mirella reached for the cup in his hand. "My father did not leave me a debt. He left me a choice. Gideon allowed her to take it, and I choose to remain. You do not know what remaining beside me will cost. I know what leaving will cost." His eyes lifted to hers. Mirella stood before him with rain-dark hair, muddy boots, and strength that had frightened whole crowds. Yet the courage in her next breath had nothing to do with what she could lift. "I love the man who defended my name, the man who sharpened my knife and pretended the salve appeared by itself, the man who made a place at his table before he knew whether I would stay." Gideon's expression broke open with grief and wonder. "I love you," she continued, "but I will not love you as a repayment for my father." He touched her cheek with a calloused hand. "I have no right to ask for more. Then stop asking what you deserve." She leaned into his palm. "Ask what you are willing to give." Gideon breathed her name. "Everything that remains." They returned to town as the auction bell began ringing. People filled the courthouse yard. The banker stood beside the official table, where the ranch deed lay beneath a stone weight. Mirella moved forward, but the auction officer raised one hand. "The transfer filed by Gideon Mercer has been recorded. The property belongs to Mirella, subject to the debt." Gideon stepped back from the crowd. The officer continued, "She may accept ownership and settle the balance. If she refuses the transfer, the ranch returns to auction immediately." Mirella looked at Gideon. Acceptance would preserve the land, but he intended to ride away with nothing. Refusal would keep him beside her only long enough to watch their home sold. The bell rang a second time. The auction officer lifted the gavel. "Mirella, choose." The gavel hovered above the table. Mirella looked from the deed to Gideon, then toward the people gathered beneath the courthouse trees. 26 days of fear had narrowed the world into two choices, both shaped by another person. She had spent too many years accepting choices made for her. The auction officer frowned. "You refuse the transfer? I refuse the question." A murmur crossed the yard. Mirella opened the purse at her belt and placed the remaining banknotes beside the ledger. "The deposit stays. It purchases one half of the ranch." The banker leaned forward. "The debt requires more. It will have more." The mother whose child Mirella had saved stepped from the crowd. Her husband followed with payment for 6 calves. 2 ranchers added advance money for yearlings. The owner of the black stallion offered the reward Mirella had refused. "These are honest contracts," Mirella declared, "not charity." Gideon moved beside her. "The ranch can meet the balance after the autumn sale." The banker calculated twice before lowering his pen. "With these purchases and the deposit, the bank will extend the remainder." The auction officer set down the gavel. Mirella lifted the transfer deed and tore it along the blank margin, not through the legal writing. "Prepare a new deed.
one half in my name.
One half in Gideon Mercer's name. Gideon stared at her. Mirella, you called me your partner before the town. Now stand by it. His eyes shone beneath his hat. I gave the ranch to free you. You nearly lost me by deciding freedom meant life without you. The crowd disappeared from his awareness. Only Mirella remained, towering before him with road dust in the seams of her dress and the brass sun over her heart. I protected you at first because of Elias, Gideon admitted. Then I watched you hold a frightened mare as though her fear deserved respect. I watched you repair what everyone else stepped around. Somewhere between that fallen timber and the second cup, duty ended. Mirella waited. Protection became devotion. The words needed no ornament. Gideon removed his hat. I love you. Not because of what I owe the dead, because mourning became a place I wished to reach when I knew you would be there. Mirella took his weathered hand. Then reach it beside me. The new deed was written before noon. Gideon signed first. Mirella signed beneath him, not as a rescued woman, not as a creditor, and not as the daughter of his lost friend. She signed as an equal owner of the land they had chosen together. The auction ended without a sale. No villain was defeated that day. Something quieter happened. A man surrendered the belief that suffering proved loyalty. A woman released the belief that usefulness was the price of belonging. The town witnessed two powerful people stop using sacrifice as a shield against love. That evening, Gideon and Mirella returned to the ranch beneath a sky washed clean by the storm. The injured mare waited near the repaired fence. Mirella stroked the white mark above her fetlock while Gideon secured the final rail. This was where you found me, Mirella murmured. This was where you found me. She smiled, and he understood the difference. Autumn reddened the grass along the hills. The calf contract settled the bank balance, and the notice marked paid was placed beside Elias's letter. Mirella did not hide the letter again. Some truths remained painful, but pain no longer made them shameful. Winter brought deep snow. Gideon's hip worsened in the cold, and Mirella learned to walk beside him without reaching too quickly. He learned to accept her arm before pride turned pain into danger. When spring returned, they placed Elias's name upon the river stone. They carved no account of death. They carved only that he had chosen courage, and that courage had continued beyond him. The town changed slowly. Some people still stared at Mirella. Fewer mocked her. Children came to learn how calm hands could guide frightened horses. Neighbors sought her advice about wagons and fencing, no longer treating her strength as a spectacle. Gideon never became talkative. Love did not transform him into another man. It made him more honestly himself. He began speaking before silence could become punishment. Mirella began resting before exhaustion could become proof of worth. Years later, Dawn still found Gideon in the kitchen first. He ground coffee while the ranch settled beneath pale light. 2 cups waited on the table. The second cup no longer belonged to regret. Mirella entered with loose hair, heavy steps, and sleep softening her strong face. She sat opposite him, wrapped both hands around the warm tin, and watched sunrise touch the cottonwoods. Neither needed to fill every silence. Some silence was not emptiness. Some silence was home. The old cowboy, who had once poured coffee for the dead, lifted his cup toward the living woman beside him, grateful that love had not asked either of them to become weaker. It had only taught them that even the strongest heart was never meant to carry everything alone. This story is a fictional work created for entertainment and emotional storytelling purposes. All names, characters, ranches, towns, businesses, events, and incidents are imaginary or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual people, living or deceased, or to real events is entirely coincidental. Although the story uses broad imagery associated with the 19th century American frontier, it is not intended to serve as a historical record. Certain locations, customs, timelines, and practical details may have been adapted or dramatized to support the fictional narrative. The story promotes family-safe themes of dignity, emotional healing, compassion, courage, equality, belonging, forgiveness, and second chances. It does not endorse discrimination, humiliation, exploitation, harassment, cruelty, or harmful conduct toward any person or group.